Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I am Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're doing a special episode, which they're all special to me, but to Tony especially. We are have gone through the past about year or so, walking through the book, What About Evil? A Defense of God's Sovereign Glory. And we've done 2 episodes per chapter on the for most of it. Some of them we had to do 3. Yeah. Some that we thought we weren't going to have much to talk about, we ended up doing 3. And those that we thought, oh, this is a big chapter, we condensed into 1 or 2. So we've had a joy of going through this book, and so we decided to bring back our very first guest, all the way back from episode 13, Scott Christensen, who is joining us today, and he's the associate pastor at Kernville Bible Church and author of What About Free Will, which has more highlighting than I probably want to care to admit in this. And then, of course, our book that we've gone over the past is What About Evil? A Defense of God's Sovereign Glory. And so we decided to bring back our first guest and our first returning guest, Pastor Scott Christensen. Pastor Christensen, welcome to the show again.
Well, thanks for having me back. It's my pleasure to be with you.
We appreciate it. I did more good highlighting in this book than drawing question marks in this and having to have Tony explain it to me. But let's see. Tomorrow in the show, I did a little review, and I said how much I appreciated this book because I've been trying to in my own walk, trying to apply my theology proper. So I've been trying to apply not just the facts of who God is and God is love and all these ideas and have it more practically applied. And what I've enjoyed about your book is the challenge to do that in a good way. In that I think I've done interviews based on chapters of your book with people who are writing about God's story in the meta narrative, and I think one of the best chapters of the Incarnation I've read has been in your book, and one of the good overviews of the history of philosophy, chapter 2. I mean, you did this book really, really well, and so we wanted to have you on and just say we appreciated your story and how you set it up.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it was a daunting task to cover all the different subject material that I did in the book, and it felt very inadequate to the task, but hopefully it's helpful to people that have read it.
Yeah. So I first wanted to say that you laid out this book very poorly because you gave us the answer right off the start. I was saying you have to bury it in the middle of the book.
And force people to read it.
Yeah, force people to read it. You can't give them the answer in the first chapter and then build up from there. So can you explain for those who haven't been following our series, what is a theodicy, and then what is your idea from the best scriptural and theological and philosophical point is what you call the greater glory theodicy?
Yeah, a theodicy is really a way of trying to explain why a good and an all good and all powerful God would permit evil to exist in the world. And so the idea is how do we defend God against the charge that he is responsible for evil, or even the charge that God doesn't even exist because there's evil in the world. And presumably a good and powerful God would never permit evil to exist in the world. And so a theodicy is an attempt to either defend God against the charge that he is evil or against the charge that he doesn't exist because of evil, or a theodicy could be something more robust in explaining why God, in fact, does either permit or ordain evil in the world. So you really have 2 different categories historically in theological and philosophical circles: a defense when you're dealing with what's called the problem of evil, and this is what this book deals with, is a more modest approach of just simply defending God against charges that he either doesn't exist or that he does exist. He does allow evil, but somehow he is not culpable for evil. So it's fairly modest apologetic type of defense of God. Whereas a theodicy is really technically more of a positive explanation. Yes, we know that God is not culpable for evil. He does exist. Yet why has he permitted evil, or why has he ordained it to be part of his plan for history? And so technically a theodicy is a much more robust kind of response to the problem of evil, seeking to give a true explanation for why there is evil in the world. And but just to back up a little bit, the word theodicy itself is a term that basically combines the Greek word for God, which is theos, and the Greek word for justify, which is dike. So you combine those two words together, and the transliterated term is theodicy. And I forget offhand who coined that term, but it was back in the 1600s, I think, 1700s. But anyway, that's a theodicy.
And you kind of, you deal with this a lot in your book. So what you've just outlined there is kind of two separate, different approaches to how we try to deal with the issue of, evil, God and evil. And the defense approach, which, as you mentioned, is kind of a just a soft way, apparently, to deal
right.
with it, has to do with, usually when we think about that, we're thinking about the free will defense. And
yes.
You kind of take issue with that particular approach in your book. So could you kind of explain for us, how you capture the free will defense and maybe a couple of issues that you have with that particular? And I know we're kind of jumping off really quickly here into some.
Yeah, so there's really two basic ways that historically Christians have addressed the problem of evil, either in terms of a defense or a theodicy. And the most common response is called the free will defense. And then the other approach is generally known as the greater good defense. And of course, my theodicy, as you may guess, is a variation of the greater good theodicy or defense, and I call my theodicy the greater glory theodicy for reasons I can explain later. But anyway, the free will defense is the most common defense, and it is based on the assumption that a particular definition of free will is self-apparent or true. And so in philosophical and theological circles, this particular brand of free will is called libertarian free will. It's not the political philosophy, but it's the idea that nothing decisively or sufficiently can determine what choices we make. And so we are autonomous as human beings in terms of our choices. They're not sufficiently determined by anything, including God himself. And so in that sense, our choices are free and they're indeterministic, some people will say. But furthermore, that means that you could have always chosen differently in the same set of circumstances. So you have same set of circumstances up to the time and point of choosing, and you could equally choose A or not A in those same set of circumstances at that same point. And nothing sufficiently determines whether you would choose A or not A. And so this is what free will theists define as free will. And so what that means for what's called the free will defense is that God free will theists will say that God granted human beings this ability to have this kind of free will, and God doesn't interfere with that free will because it's necessary in order to maintain what they believe to be moral responsibility. Without free will, you cannot be morally responsible for your choices. They also would say that this kind of free will is necessary for loving relationships. And furthermore, it guards God against being the author of evil. It guards God against being morally responsible for evil. So the opposite view, of course, would be that God in his sovereignty determines the whole course of history. And so the free will theist says, well, if you believe that, then that means God has to then be morally responsible for evil in the world. So the free will defense basically says, if free will is true, and they believe it is, and if God does not interfere with the choices of human beings, and yet this is a valuable thing to have in order to preserve moral responsibility and to preserve, for example, loving relationships, they would say, we can't truly love God unless we are free to love God, and vice versa. God must be free in his love toward us. And so there's this sort of free exchange where no strings tied, to our choices. And that's the way they would argue. And that's a very valuable thing. However, it comes with a great risk.
Yeah. And almost,
yeah.
Not to interrupt you here, but so no strings are tied, and yet it seems like, and I'm sure this is where you're going, it ties a rope around God, right?
Yeah. Yes. It makes God dependent on the choices of human beings. And so if God does not interfere with our choices, and he could, it's important to recognize that those who hold to this view, and typically it is connected with classical Arminianism, but other free will theists would include people like open theists, if your hearers know what that is, and another brand of theology called Molinism. There's some differences between those three basic brands of free will theism, but what is common to all of them is that they have this same definition of free will. And so the idea is that if God grants human beings this kind of free will, then God is taking a risk that people will use their choices to make bad choices. And so these evil choices is what generates evil in the world. And it's just part of the risk that God has to take in order to create a world where people have free will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
so supposedly that position guards God against the charge that he would be the author of evil. And essentially God himself has no choice. If he's going to create a world where loving, valuable relationships occur, those relationships presumably have to be based on this free will. I have to, in order to really express love, I have to have the equal ability to say, I don't want to love you. I'd rather hate you. And if I don't have that ability to make the choice between love or hate, then I'm not really free, and I'm not really responsible. I'm just a robot. I'm just a programmed computer, and I have no free will. And so that's the argument.
I think one of the best counter arguments, especially to that one, because I think that one's a very powerful argument against your position. But the best counterexample is who God is, which is in a Trinity. Is Jesus, is the Holy Spirit, is the Father? Are they allowed not to love each other in the triune nature? And so if they don't have the so-called freedom to hate each other, is that true love? Well, we would say that in the existence of God before creation, he was in perfect unity. One of the positive qualities of Trinity, as opposed to strict monotheism like Islam, is that God kind of has to learn love in that capacity. And here, by having a triune nature with three persons, there is no learning love. He is loving towards the other members of the Trinity. And so does God have the ability to not love in that relationship? And I think that's one of the powerful counterexamples to your book on that point.
Yeah, exactly. God himself does not have this kind of freedom. And so this sort of freedom is necessary for loving relationships. Well, God himself doesn't have it, because it's not even possible for God to express hate, right? That would be the capacity for sin existing within God. And there is no capacity for sin within God. And so, the love that exists among the members of the Trinity, there can be no other possibility. There's no possibility of hatred among members of the Trinity. There's only the possibility of perfect, unhindered love between the Father and the Son and the Spirit. And so God doesn't have this kind of free will. And if God doesn't have that kind of free will, and it's not necessary for God to be morally responsible in his relationships with each other or with us, then why is it necessary for us to have that? Yeah. And so that's one of the arguments against free will.
Right. And to say too, what I appreciate about your last book, and it followed into this book, which I'm always happy to see, is the other side laid out using kind of their definitions, their terms, but then interacting with it in a positive light. In fact, many of the five theodicies that you list, I'm sorry, the six here, you talk about positives that they have, and you kind of incorporate into your answer for the theodicy.
Yeah, I thought that was that was one of the things that we observed really quickly in the book. It seemed like you were really fair with the other side in terms of making sure that you clearly explain where they were coming from, why they held the positions that they held, and so that was. And so you could really understand where the folks who you definitely disagree with, but, where their good points were and that sort of thing. So that we really appreciated that when we were going through this book. That was really helpful.
Yeah, rarely in these debates do you find someone embracing something so painfully false that it's just, that there's nothing of value to learn from that. I think there's some many valuable points that free will theists make, and it's important to understand where some of those strong points are. There is a sense in which we have to have some concept of freedom of will, because we recognize that we make decisions willfully, right? Whether they be sinful decisions or whether they be godly decisions, depending on the situation and the person, in terms of whether or not they're regenerate or unregenerate as Christians or non-Christians, and what stands behind those choices. For example, free will theists will accuse Calvinists of a brand of choosing, of free will, if you want to call it that involves coercion. Well, that'd be a serious charge if that were true. And, if God determining our choices was a matter of coercion, I think the free will theists would be correct in saying that our freedom of choice and our moral responsibility has been rendered mute. If coercion were involved, we know from experience that if somebody is forced to do something against their will with a gun pointed to their head, to do something evil, that they're not morally responsible for that. And so part of the charge of free will theists towards Calvinists is that your brand of free will involves coercion, because you could do no other, right? And so they assume that means coercion. The task of the Calvinists is to say, no, that's not coercion. So it's important to listen to both sides of the argument, because they do make good points, but do they misrepresent each other? And so, you always have to do your best effort to represent the opposition the way that they themselves would argue, and then look for the weaknesses in their arguments.
Yeah. So Patrick has already pointed out, and I think you do it in your book, with this issue of God and love and in the Trinity. Is there any what do you think? Is there any other arguments against this free will defense that you think are really, causes it not to work, I guess, for a good theodicy?
Well, yeah, there's a number of reasons why I think the libertarian brand of free will is not coherent. From a scriptural standpoint, I believe it's not coherent because the Bible makes it very clear that God is sovereign over all of history, and that he has determined everything that takes place in the course of history. And I seek through several chapters to demonstrate that. And I believe that he is sovereign over both good and evil, and that evil, in fact, serves God's purposes. And that if something evil were to occur in a world that God might plan or ordain that did not serve some purpose that God had, some good or greater purpose, then if that evil had not occurred, then he certainly would not have ordained it to happen. And we know of cases in which God has said, certain amount of evil will be allowed in his plan, and then beyond that, no. A good example of that would be the Great Flood in Genesis. The world had become so evil that God had determined that this is not going to continue this way. And so he designed, Noah and the flood to wipe out the world and to start over. And we have many examples of that kind of thing. Nonetheless, the point is that the Bible is very clear about God's sovereignty over both good and evil. What the Bible is less clear about is some fine-tuned definition of free will. And so I think it's important to not overstate the case. And I bring this out in my previous book, What About Free Will, that the Bible does not give us some clear definition of free will, but it certainly doesn't embrace the libertarian view of free will. I believe it's far more supportive of what is called the compatibilist view of free will, that our free choices are compatible with God's meticulous sovereignty. And so I think that would be an argument against free will, and probably the most powerful argument in my mind. Another very powerful argument against free will is the doctrine of foreknowledge. Both Arminians and Calvinists agree that God knows every future event in history exhaustively. And therefore, it's not possible for something that God does not foreknow to happen contrary to what he already knows. And yet that's part of the definition of free will from Arminians and other free will theists, is that at the moment of choosing, you could always go in opposite directions. And if that's the case, you could never know beforehand what those choices might be.
Right. There goes the prophecy.
It's a huge problem for Arminians and other free will theists. And they have turned themselves, I believe they've turned themselves in all kinds of knots and circles trying to answer that question, and have done so in a very unsatisfactory way. The fact of the matter is that God knows that you're going to wake up tomorrow morning and drink, a cup of Folgers coffee at 9:03 a.m. Is it possible for you at 9:03 a.m. to fool God and drink a glass of lemonade instead? If that's the case, then you have eviscerated God's omniscience, and that is one of the attributes of God that we cannot deny. And so, the problem of foreknowledge is a very big problem.
I think on the opposite end of the spectrum, it still doesn't let the monist or the provisionist kind of get away from that nomenclature of author of evil, because God still actualizes a universe in which and it's always the rape of a child, or it's always something very, very strong, emotional that they put forward. It's always actualized in a world where X evil happens, and so God is authoring a world in which those things he knows to happen. So it almost it maybe takes a step backwards and looks at the point of creation. But from there, God can't do otherwise, because then he would be interfering. And so it seems to be the point against Calvinism seems to still work against them for their point of view too.
Yeah, you can't escape these problems. For example, for the open theists, the open theist, I think, has the most consistent view of free will, because basically they deny that God has any foreknowledge of future events. Now, God can know with great accuracy what future events might be, but he can't know with absolute certainty what those events might be. Mm-hmm. They would say that God has exhaustive pre-knowledge, of everything in the past up to the present, and he can use that knowledge to predict the future. And he's really good at predicting the future. Right. And that's how they treat prophecy. But he doesn't know exhaustively what the future holds. He can't know with any certainty, with 100% absolute certainty what any future event holds. Nonetheless, let's consider the case of a serial rapist or a serial murderer. The open theist God may not know that this guy's going to commit murder, but after the second or third murder, he knows what this guy's probably going to do. Why doesn't he stop him at that point? Mm-hmm. God does, the open theist agrees that God has the sovereign power to intervene. Now, of course, the same is true of the Arminian. If the Arminian knows, that the Arminian God knows that this serial rapist is going to continue to rape these, 30 odd women or whatever, why doesn't he intervene and stop? So they end up with the same type of problems that they accuse the Calvinists of having because of the foreknowledge issue. And the Molinist just ties himself in circles with the same thing. So the bottom line is that you have to have a much more robust understanding of God's relationship to evil than any of those viewpoints provide us. And even many Calvinists shy away from the kind of theodicy that I present in my book, because it seems absolutely audacious to say that God has some kind of greater good that would come out of evil. And so many Calvinists are very reluctant to go down that path. But the fact is that that's the only other viable position that you would have to hold to if you reject these other positions.
Yeah. So just before we get to your specifics of your position, let's talk about one other probably popular position. Leibniz has a theodicy that sounds similar to the type of thing that you're doing, although, as you point out in the book, it's very different, right? So could you, he has a best of all possible worlds type of thing, and it's a theodicy to help, explain or defend what God is doing. Could you just share that with us a bit, and then maybe that'll lead us into, as you talk about how that's different than your position, now lead us into more specifics of what your position is.
Yeah, I'm very favorable to Leibniz's position, but he fails to answer some important questions about his position. So basically, Leibniz's position, he was a philosopher in the 1700s, I think, early 1700s, that put forth this theodicy called the best of all possible worlds. And the idea is that God is a perfect being. And this comes from classical theism, which most Orthodox Christians would adhere to. Not in the fullest sense. Arminians don't always embrace everything that classical theism teaches. Nonetheless, Calvinists do. And so the idea is that a perfect God would only create a world that is perfect. And so that presents obviously a problem at face value, because why would anyone think that evil in the world is a perfect world? So Leibniz says, well, it's because God has some greater good. So really the best of all possible worlds is a version of what is called the greater good type of theodicy or defense. And there's a number that fall within that category. And I try to demonstrate that in the book. But anyway, so he would say that God must have some good purpose in evil. The problem is that Leibniz never tells us what that might be or what those greater goods might actually be. Just that we have to agree that they would be. Furthermore, we have to agree that God would make a world that is perfect, and there is no better world than the one that he created. The problem with that is that how can we know for sure that this is the best possible world that God could have created? I think the best that we can say, and this is what I attempt to say in my book, is that I think we could say that there is no greater world that God could have made, but there could have been equally other worlds that are not worse than the one that he has created. And I think that has less philosophical problems. And again, that's, we're speculating based on inferences that we make from the character of God and from Scripture. So I believe that the best of all possible worlds theodicy that Leibniz developed does have some great value to it. It's just that he doesn't answer a lot of those questions. And I think he makes a mistake of saying that this is the only possible world God could have created. That is the best world. I think it's presumptuous for us to say that God was locked into only making this type of world with the exact, balance of good and evil and everything that happens. To me, that's restricting God too much. Nonetheless, I do argue in my book that there is no greater world than the one God has created in which certain things occur. And namely, those things have to do with the incarnation, the death and resurrection, the ascension, the second coming, and the eternal state that is all centered around Jesus Christ. And so there is no greater world that we could conceive of in which there would be no incarnation, death, resurrection, ascension, and final victorious establishment of Christ's eternal kingdom than in such the world that God has created. And so any good, supremely good world that God could have conceived of would have to include the incarnation, death, resurrection, ascension, and second coming of Christ to establish his kingdom forever. And that's part of my argument in the book.